Imagine standing on the banks of the Thames, looking up at the glass towers of the City of London. From a distance they still gleam with the arrogance of old money, projecting power, projecting stability. Now cut to the industrial heartland of Germany's Ruhr Valley, where smokestacks that once powered an entire continent are going cold, one by one. On the surface, these are two very different worlds. One is a service-based island nation that gambled everything on independence. The other is a manufacturing colossus that bet its soul on a union of 27 nations. But look closer. Look past the politicians' speeches and the stock market rallies. You will see the same cracks in the foundation. You will smell the same rot. We are witnessing a slow-motion car crash involving two of the world's largest economies. And the terrifying part isn't that one of them is going to crash. It's that they are racing each other to the bottom. For years the narrative has been simple. If you read the British press, the European Union is a bureaucratic dinosaur, sinking under the weight of regulation and a single currency that doesn't work. If you listen to Brussels, the United Kingdom is a cautionary tale of isolationism. A country that shot itself in the foot with Brexit and is now bleeding out. But what if they are both right? What if this isn't a competition of who is winning, but a desperate struggle to see who can survive the coming winter? We are about to dissect the anatomy of a collapse. We are going to look at the numbers they don't want you to see, the debt that is silently accumulating like a tumor, and the energy crisis that is deindustrializing the cradle of Western civilization. Before we descend into this economic horror story, I have a question for you, and I want you to answer it honestly in the comments right now. Looking at the trajectory of the last 5 years, if you had to bet your entire life savings on the survival of just one currency over the next decade, the British pound or the euro, which one would you choose? Pause for a second. Think about the stability of your own future, and write your choice down below. While you are there, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, because the analysis we are about to do is going to arm you with the truth you need to navigate the chaos ahead. Let's strip away the illusions. To understand this race to the bottom, we have to start with the engine of any economy: growth, or rather the lack of it. For the United Kingdom, the stagnation is almost palpable. It hangs in the air like a heavy fog. Since the 2008 financial crisis, British productivity has flatlined in a way that is historically unprecedented. We aren't just talking about a bad quarter or a sluggish year. We are talking about a fundamental breakdown in the machine. The British worker today is barely producing more than they did 15 years ago. Think about that. 15 years of technological advancement. Smartphones. Better software. Yet the output per hour has barely budged. Why? Because the UK stopped investing in itself. It became an economy addicted to cheap labor and rising asset prices. Instead of building factories or upgrading infrastructure, money poured into the housing market, creating a mirage of wealth while the real economy withered. Across the channel, the situation looks different, but the outcome is terrifyingly similar. The Eurozone, led by Germany, was supposed to be the powerhouse. It was the export machine of the world. But that machine was built on two pillars: cheap Russian energy and endless Chinese demand. In the span of 24 months, both of those pillars have been kicked out from under them. The German business model is broken. Import cheap gas. Make high-quality cars. Sell them to Beijing. It is not just paused. It is obsolete. We are seeing numbers coming out of Berlin that would make a recession look like a picnic. Industrial production is plummeting. Chemical giants like BASF are scaling back operations in the country that invented the chemical industry. This isn't a cycle. It's a structural collapse. When you compare the two, you see a terrifying symmetry. The UK is suffering from a self-inflicted wound called Brexit, which erected trade barriers with its biggest neighbor, increasing costs and paperwork for every single business trying to sell a widget across the channel. It was a decision driven by politics, not economics. And the bill is now coming due. Small businesses in Birmingham or Manchester, which used to export seamlessly to France or Germany, are now drowning in customs declarations. They are giving up. They are shutting down. The UK economy is shrinking not because it lacks talent, but because it voluntarily tied one hand behind its back. But do not think for a second that the EU is laughing. The European Union is suffering from a paralysis of a different kind. It is a slow death by consensus. While the UK is chaotic and impulsive, the EU is rigid and terrified of change. They have regulated their tech sector out of existence. Where is the European Google? Where is the European Apple? There isn't one. The continent has become a museum. A place for tourists to look at old buildings while the actual innovation happens in Silicon Valley or Shenzhen. They are regulating AI before they even have an AI industry. This is the difference in their decline. The UK is erratic, flailing like a drowning swimmer, while the EU is sinking like a stone weighed down by its own heavy armor. Let's talk about the specific mechanism of this decline, starting with the first major point of failure: the energy suicide. This is where the race gets dangerous. In the UK, the energy market is a disaster of privatization gone wrong. They closed down their gas storage facilities to save a few pennies, leaving the country nakedly exposed when prices spiked. The average British household has faced energy bills that have doubled, tripled, forcing a choice that no citizen of a G7 nation should ever have to make: heat or eat. The government had to step in with massive subsidies just to prevent civil unrest. But those subsidies are paid for with borrowed money. They are mortgaging the future to keep the lights on today. The grid is old, creaking, and desperate for investment that isn't coming. Germany's energy situation, however, is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. They did everything right, according to the green agenda. Yet they ended up burning coal. They shut down their nuclear power plants. Clean, reliable baseload power. In a knee-jerk reaction to Fukushima, a disaster that happened on the other side of the world in a tsunami zone. They replaced that nuclear power with a dependency on a pipeline from Moscow. When that pipeline was shut off, the heart of German industry went into cardiac arrest. You cannot run a steel mill on solar panels in November. You cannot run a chemical plant on wind turbines when the air is still. The result is deindustrialization. Companies are not just closing. They are moving. They are packing up and going to the United States or China, where energy is cheap. Once those factories leave, they do not come back. That is the terrifying reality the EU is facing. A permanent loss of its industrial capacity. The UK looks at Germany and says, "At least we have our own wind power, at least we have the North Sea." But the North Sea is drying up, and the windfall taxes imposed by the British government have scared away the investment needed to extract what's left. So both regions are trapped. The UK is trapped by a lack of long-term planning and a fragmented privatized market that prioritizes shareholder dividends over national security. The EU is trapped by ideology, by a green transition that was rushed and botched, leaving them vulnerable to geopolitical blackmail. Who is worse? It depends on how you measure pain. Is it the sharp, sudden shock of a British household bill? Or the slow, agonizing death of a German industrial town? Now we have to look at the money itself. The currency. The store of value for your labor. In 2022, we saw the British pound almost reach parity with the US dollar. It was a moment of national humiliation. The markets looked at the UK's budget, saw unfunded tax cuts and spiraling debt, and they panicked. The bond vigilantes arrived. It was a warning shot. It showed that the UK is no longer a safe haven. It is an emerging market with a posh accent. The credibility of the Bank of England was shredded. People realized that the emperor had no clothes. The pound has recovered slightly since then, but the underlying weakness remains. The UK runs a massive current account deficit, meaning it relies on the kindness of strangers to fund its lifestyle. If those strangers stop buying British debt, the currency collapses. But the euro? The euro is a Frankenstein currency. It stitches together economies that have nothing in common. You have the frugal, productive North, Germany and the Netherlands, and the debt-ridden, stagnant South, Italy, Greece, Spain. For years the North subsidized the South. But now the North is sick. Germany can no longer afford to be the paymaster of Europe. And this brings us to the most dangerous point of tension. Interest rates. The European Central Bank has one interest rate for everyone. If they raise rates to fight inflation in Germany, they bankrupt the homeowners in Italy. If they lower rates to save Italy, they let inflation run rampant in Germany. It is a trap with no exit. They are trying to pilot a plane where the left engine wants to go up and the right engine wants to go down. Eventually, the fuselage snaps. We are witnessing the unraveling of the social contract. The unspoken agreement between the state and the citizen that says, you work hard, you pay your taxes, and we will ensure a stable life. That agreement has been breached in both the UK and the EU. But the cracks are manifesting differently. In the UK, the breach is visible in the crumbling public services. The National Health Service, once the crown jewel of the British state, is on its knees. Waiting lists are in the millions. Ambulances queue for hours outside emergency rooms. This isn't just a management issue. It is a symptom of an economy that can no longer generate the tax revenue needed to sustain a first-world welfare state. The UK is becoming a poor country with rich people living in it. The wealth is concentrating in fewer hands, mostly in London, while the rest of the country looks more like Eastern Europe in the 1990s than a leading G7 nation. This disparity creates a volatile political environment. The strikes we have seen, train drivers, nurses, teachers, are not just about pay. They are a scream of frustration from a workforce that has seen its standard of living degrade year after year. Real wages in the UK are lower today than they were in 2008. Think about the psychological toll of that. A whole generation has known nothing but stagnation. They work harder. The technology gets better. But they can buy less. The housing market in the UK exacerbates this to a criminal degree. House prices are so detached from earnings that homeownership is now a fantasy for anyone under 40 without rich parents. This creates a society of renters, transient and insecure, unable to put down roots or build capital. Cross the channel and the social contract is fraying for a different reason. In the EU, particularly in France and Germany, the crisis is fueled by a feeling of betrayal regarding protection. The European model was built on high taxes in exchange for high security. But that security is vanishing. The pension systems are ticking time bombs. The demographics of Europe are catastrophic. The population is aging rapidly. There are fewer young people entering the workforce to pay for the pensions of the retirees. In France, when the government tried to raise the retirement age by just 2 years, the country erupted. Paris burned. It wasn't just about the 2 years. It was an expression of deep existential dread. The people realized that the promises made to them cannot be kept. The math simply does not work. This demographic winter is hitting Germany the hardest. They are running out of workers. Not just skilled engineers, but workers of all kinds. To maintain their economy, they need millions of immigrants. But migration is the single most explosive political issue in Europe. We are seeing the rise of far-right parties in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Germany itself. This political fragmentation makes it impossible to make hard economic decisions. How can you reform an economy when you cannot even form a stable government? The EU is paralyzed by its own democracy, gridlocked by conflicting interests and a population that is terrified of the future. Let's return to the industrial argument, because this is where the race to collapse becomes a race against history. The automotive industry is the perfect case study. 4 decades, made in Germany, was the gold standard. It meant quality, engineering, dominance. The German car industry is not just a business. It is the backbone of the entire European economy. Supply chains stretch from Poland to Spain. But they missed the turn. They laughed at Tesla. They underestimated the Chinese. Now Chinese electric vehicles are flooding the European market. They are cheaper. The software is better. And the battery technology is superior. The European auto giants are panic-stricken. They are demanding tariffs, begging for protectionism. But tariffs are a sign of weakness, not strength. If you have to tax your competitor to survive, you have already lost the innovation war. The UK, meanwhile, decimated its own car industry years ago. What remains is largely foreign-owned. The British tragedy is that they pivoted to services. banking, consulting, education, thinking that was the future. Cool Britannia. But you cannot export a haircut. You cannot export a consultancy meeting in the same way you can export a machine tool. When the global economy tightens, services are the first thing to be cut. People stop hiring expensive London lawyers. They stop sending their kids to expensive British universities. The UK economy is dangerously exposed to global sentiment. It is a luxury brand in a world that is switching to discount shopping. And then there is the elephant in the room: defense. For 70 years, both the UK and the EU outsourced their security to the United States. They spent their money on welfare states instead of armies. Now the world is on fire. War has returned to the European continent. The illusion of eternal peace is shattered. Suddenly, these governments need to find billions for defense spending. Where is that money going to come from? They are already taxed to the limit. They are already drowning in debt. To rebuild their militaries, they will have to cut social spending. That is the political suicide pill no one wants to swallow. The UK army is at its smallest size since the Napoleonic Wars. The German army is notoriously under-equipped. Rearming is not a choice. It is a necessity for survival. But it will bankrupt the current economic model. Let's look at the red tape war. This is where the difference in their collapse becomes almost comical. The EU is strangling itself with good intentions. The bureaucratic burden of doing business in Europe is immense. The ESG regulations, the data privacy laws, the labor restrictions. Each one individually makes sense, perhaps. But together they form a thicket that no startup can hack through. That is why there is no European tech giant. A young entrepreneur in Paris or Berlin spends more time filing compliance reports than building a product. The capital flees to America. The UK post-Brexit promised a bonfire of regulations. They promised to become Singapore-on-Thames. Agile, low-tax, business-friendly. But they lied. They haven't cut the red tape. They just painted it red, white, and blue. They created their own duplicate agencies, their own certification marks. So now a British business has to comply with UK rules and EU rules if they want to export. It is double the bureaucracy, not less. The Brexit dividend turned out to be a liability. The UK is now a medium-sized island with delusions of grandeur, trying to negotiate trade deals with superpowers who view it as a desperate junior partner. The trade deal with Australia? It hurt British farmers. The trade deal with the US? It never happened. The UK is discovering that sovereignty is expensive. This brings us to the psychological state of the populations. In the UK, there is a pervasive sense of decline, a feeling that nothing works anymore. The trains are cancelled. The rivers are polluted. The police don't investigate burglaries. It breeds a cynicism that is poisonous to an economy. If people don't believe the future will be better, they don't invest. They don't start businesses. They hoard. They check out. It is a quiet quitting on a national scale. In the EU, the mood is different but equally dangerous. It is anxiety. It is the fear of being squeezed between the US and China. Europeans feel their relevance slipping away. They see their continent becoming a theme park for American tourists and a dumping ground for Chinese goods. There is a sense of loss of control. The decisions are made in Brussels or Washington or Beijing, but never locally. This drives the anger we see on the streets. The farmers blocking highways in the Netherlands. The riots in France. These are not unrelated events. They are the spasms of a dying system. Now consider the debt again, but this time look at the corporate debt. In the era of zero interest rates, European and British companies loaded up on cheap loans. They became zombie companies. Businesses that only survive because they can borrow money for free to pay off old debts. Now that interest rates have risen, the bill is due. We are facing a wave of corporate bankruptcies. When these companies fail, unemployment rises. When unemployment rises, tax revenue falls and welfare spending goes up. The deficit widens. The debt grows. It is a doom loop. The UK is particularly vulnerable here because its economy is so reliant on consumer spending. If the British consumer stops spending because they are afraid of losing their job, the economy crashes overnight. We need to zoom in on the specific mechanism of the housing market collapse, because this is where the wealth of the middle class is stored, and where it is currently evaporating. In the UK, the obsession with property is almost pathological. For 40 years, the British economy has effectively been a property market with a country attached to it. The government propped up prices with schemes creating a bubble that makes 2008 look modest. But now mortgage rates have spiked. People coming off fixed-rate deals are seeing their monthly payments double. This sucks disposable income out of the economy like a vacuum. Every pound spent on a mortgage is a pound not spent in a restaurant, a shop, or a local business. The high street dies because the bank needs to be paid. But here is the twist. The UK can't let the housing market crash. If prices fall significantly, the banks become insolvent, because the loans on their books are secured by those houses. So the government is paralyzed. They can't let prices fall, but people can't afford to buy. The market freezes. Transactions stop. Construction stops. House builders go bust. It is a slow suffocation. In the EU, the housing dynamic is different but equally toxic. In Germany, a nation of renters, the large property companies are in free fall. Vonovia, the giant landlord, has been selling off apartments to pay down debt. Construction of new homes has collapsed because materials are too expensive and regulations are too strict. The shortage of housing in major cities is driving rents to insane levels, eating into the wages of the workers that Germany desperately needs to attract. You cannot have an industrial renaissance if the workers have nowhere to sleep. In places like Sweden and the Netherlands, household debt is astronomical. If the ECB keeps rates high to fight inflation, they risk blowing up the Scandinavian banking systems. It is another front in the war where there are no good options. Let's switch gears to the brain drain. This is a metric that doesn't show up in GDP figures immediately, but it kills you 10 years later. The brightest minds in the UK and the EU are leaving. If you are a top AI researcher, a geneticist, or a software engineer, why would you stay? In the UK, you face stagnant wages, crumbling infrastructure, and high taxes. In the EU, you face a glass ceiling of bureaucracy and a culture that penalizes risk-taking. So they go to Austin, to Palo Alto, to Singapore. The UK is hemorrhaging its most valuable resource, human capital. The universities are still world-class. Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial. But they are becoming incubators for American corporations. We educate them, and then they leave. We are exporting our future. This brings us to the geopolitical irrelevance mentioned earlier. The world is splitting into blocks. The US bloc and the China bloc. The EU wants to be a third pole, a regulatory superpower. But you cannot be a superpower just by writing rules. You need hard power and you need economic leverage. The EU is losing both. They are caught in the middle. The US passes the Inflation Reduction Act, subsiding green tech with billions of dollars. European companies scream unfair and threaten to leave. The EU tries to respond, but it doesn't have the fiscal firepower of the US Treasury. They are bringing a knife to a gunfight. The UK is even more isolated. The special relationship with the US is a sentimental myth. The Americans are ruthless pragmatists. They look at the UK and see a diminishing asset, a market that is shrinking, a military that is shrinking, and a political system that is unstable. The UK thought it could be global Britain, a buccaneering free trader. Instead, it is finding itself squeezed out of supply chains. When the US and EU negotiate standards on steel or data, the UK is not in the room. They have to accept the rules set by others. They have taken back control only to discover that the steering wheel is not connected to the wheels. Let's dissect the inflation nightmare further. We talk about percentages. 5%, 10%. But let's talk about the reality. Food inflation in the UK has been sticky and brutal. The UK imports nearly half its food. A weak pound means expensive imports. Brexit red tape adds friction costs to every tomato and every slice of cheese coming from the continent. The supermarkets operate on razor-thin margins. The result is that the quality of food is dropping while the price rises. Skimpflation. You are paying more for less. In the EU, food inflation is also high, driven by the energy costs of production. Fertilizer is made from gas. And climate change affecting harvests in southern Europe. Olive oil, wine, grain. The staples of the European diet are under threat. This hits the poorest hardest. It fuels the populist anger we discussed. When people cannot afford to feed their children properly, they do not vote for moderates. They vote for anyone who promises to burn the system down. There is also a crisis of leadership. Look at the roster. In the UK, we saw a revolving door of prime ministers. Johnson, Truss, Sunak, Starmer. The instability makes long-term planning impossible. Who invests in a country that changes its tax policy every 6 months? The political class seems devoid of ideas, merely managing the decline. In the EU, you have leadership that is historically unpopular. Macron in France, a lame duck facing a hostile parliament. The leadership vacuum is terrifying. There is no vision. No one is standing up and saying, "This is how we fix it." They are just trying to survive the next news cycle. The green transition is another battlefield where both are failing, but in different ways. The UK has great potential for wind, but the grid connection queue is 10 years long. You can build a wind farm, but you can't plug it in. The planning laws allow local residents to block almost anything. NIMBYism is the national religion of Britain. Not in my backyard. It stops railways. It stops housing. It stops power lines. The country has fossilized. The EU has the opposite problem. They have ambitious, legally binding targets. But they are destroying their industrial base to meet them. They are taxing carbon so heavily that they are driving steel production to India and China, where it is produced with more emissions. It is carbon leakage. The global atmosphere doesn't care if the CO2 comes from Duisburg or Mumbai. But the German economy certainly cares if the jobs are in Duisburg or Mumbai. They are sacrificing their prosperity on the altar of a climate policy that is not being matched by the rest of the world. It is a noble suicide, perhaps, but a suicide nonetheless. Now consider the banking sector again. We saw with Credit Suisse how quickly a European giant can fall. The European banking sector is opaque. There are billions of euros of non-performing loans sitting on balance sheets in Italy and Spain. These are loans that will never be paid back. Everyone knows it. But they pretend otherwise to keep the system running. Extend and pretend. But as rates stay higher for longer, the pretense becomes impossible to maintain. A banking crisis in Europe would make 2008 look like a rehearsal. The fragmentation of the Eurozone means there is no unified deposit insurance. If a bank fails in Italy, does a German taxpayer want to bail it out? No. And that no could end the euro. The UK banking sector is more consolidated, but it is massive relative to the size of the economy. The city is a beast that demands to be fed. If the city sneezes, the UK catches pneumonia. The over-financialization of the British economy means that it doesn't make things. It moves money around. In a world of geopolitical tension, tangible assets matter. Factories matter. Mines matter. Ships matter. Spreadsheets do not win wars. And they do not keep you warm in winter. The UK has bet everything on the spreadsheet. We must now confront the concept of zombie infrastructure. In the UK, the decay is visible to the naked eye. Potholes are so prevalent they have become a national joke. But they are a symbol of a deeper rot. The water companies privatized decades ago have loaded themselves with debt to pay dividends to investors, while dumping raw sewage into the rivers and seas. It is a visceral metaphor for the state of the nation. Public assets stripped for private gain, leaving filth behind. The rail network is the most expensive in Europe, yet one of the least reliable. High-Speed 2, a project meant to level up the north, has been cut back to a stump. A symbol of a nation that can no longer build big things. The cost of infrastructure in the UK is globally anomalous. It costs more to build a mile of tunnel in London than almost anywhere else on Earth. Why? Lawyers, consultants, planning inquiries. The parasitic layer of bureaucracy that feeds off every project. In Germany, the infrastructure myth is also crumbling. The Deutsche Bahn, once the envy of the world for its punctuality, is now a mess of delays and cancellations. The bridges on the autobahns are crumbling after decades of neglect. Germany lived off the investments of the post-war era without renewing them. They balanced the budget by letting their country rot. Now to fix it, they need hundreds of billions of euros that they don't have. The collapse of the digital infrastructure is even more shocking. Germany has some of the worst internet speeds in the developed world. They are a fax machine economy in a cloud computing world. This lack of digital backbone is a massive drag on productivity. You cannot run a modern AI startup if you can't get a fiber optic cable to your office. Let's talk about the culture of risk. In the US, failure is a badge of honor. You go bankrupt, you learn. You start again. In the UK and EU, failure is a stigma. Bankruptcy laws are punitive. This cultural aversion to risk is the silent killer of growth. In the UK, the tall poppy syndrome means anyone who tries to do something ambitious is torn down. In the EU, the precautionary principle means you have to prove something is safe before you can even try it. This is why the next trillion-dollar company will not be British or European. We are regulating ourselves into irrelevance. The race to the bottom is also a race to safety. A retreat into a comfortable stagnation rather than facing the volatility of innovation. And what of the internal markets? The EU's greatest achievement was the single market. Frictionless trade. But that market is fragmenting. States are starting to subsidize their own industries again to compete with China. Breaking the state aid rules. France subsidizes its factories. Germany subsidizes its chip plants. The playing field is no longer level. The solidarity is cracking. If the single market breaks down, the economic rationale for the EU evaporates. The UK, having left the single market, is trying to create its own internal market. But it is finding that difficult. The Northern Ireland Protocol has effectively put a trade border down the Irish Sea, separating one part of the UK from another. It is a constitutional absurdity that weakens the union of the kingdom itself. The Scottish nationalists look at the economic carnage of Westminster and say, "Let us out." The collapse of the UK economy is the fuel for the breakup of the UK as a political entity. We might not just be watching the decline of an economy, but the end of a nation-state that has existed for 300 years. Then there is the healthcare demographic time bomb. We touched on pensions, but healthcare is the immediate crisis. An aging population consumes exponentially more healthcare. In the UK, the NHS is swallowing the budget whole. It is becoming a black hole for money. To fund it, taxes must rise. But if taxes rise, growth stalls. It is the same in Europe. The social model of universal healthcare is facing a mathematical limit. As the ratio of workers to retirees worsens, something has to give. Either services are cut, or taxes become confiscatory. Both options lead to social instability. The race here is who breaks their promise to the elderly first. Let's look at the currency again in the context of global reserves. The US dollar is king. The euro tried to be the prince. The pound is a minor duke. As the world becomes more unstable, central banks and investors flee to the dollar. The euro's share of global reserves is stagnant. The pound's is shrinking. If you lose your status as a reserve currency, you lose the exorbitant privilege of printing money without immediate hyperinflation. The UK is dangerously close to losing that privilege. If the pound becomes just another emerging market currency, the UK's ability to import food and energy collapses. The standard of living would have overnight. This is the sterling crisis scenario that keeps Treasury officials awake at night. What about the youth? The generation rent in the UK and the generation precarious in Southern Europe. They are delaying life. They are not getting married. They are not having children. This accelerates the demographic collapse. It is a self-reinforcing downward spiral. An economy without children is an economy without a future. The birth rates in Italy and Spain are among the lowest in human history. They are literally dying out. The UK's birth rate is dropping too. The cost of childcare in the UK is the highest in the developed world. It effectively taxes women out of the workforce. It is economic madness. The soft power collapse is the final intangible. The UK used to be a cultural superpower. Music, film, the BBC. But the funding cuts to the arts and the isolation of Brexit have diminished this voice. The BBC is under attack domestically. The British Council is shrinking. In Europe, the European dream has lost its shine. It is no longer seen as the beacon of liberty and prosperity. The rest of the world looks at Europe and sees a museum run by bureaucrats. They look at the UK and see a reality TV show run by incompetents. The respect is gone. And when respect goes, influence goes. And when influence goes, trade deals get worse. Investment dries up. And the decline accelerates. So here we are. We have dissected the corpse of the British economy. And the paralyzed body of the European Union. We have looked at the debt, the demographics, the energy, and the industry. The question remains, who is actually doing worse? Who hits the ground first? The answer is a terrifying paradox. The United Kingdom is currently in a more acute and volatile crisis. It is smaller, more exposed, and lacks the buffer of a massive continent-wide market. Its inflation has been stickier. Its drop in living standards sharper. The self-inflicted wound of Brexit acts as a constant multiplier on every other problem. When the global economy sneezes, the UK catches a cold. And because of Brexit, it has no handkerchief. The risk of a sudden catastrophic financial event, a run on the pound, a gilt market collapse, is higher in the UK. It is the fragility of a lone ship in a hurricane. However, the European Union faces a deeper, more existential and structural doom. The UK can in theory pivot. It has a centralized government. It has its own central bank. If a leader with vision emerged, they could slash regulations, reform planning, and pivot the economy within a few years. The UK is a speedboat currently driving in circles and taking on water, but capable of turning. The EU is a supertanker heading for an iceberg. Its problems are baked into its very design. The single currency without a single fiscal policy. The impossible demographics of the South. The deindustrialization of the North. These are issues that cannot be fixed without rewriting the treaties. Without political integration that the voters do not want. So while the UK might crash first, the EU might crash harder. The UK could go through a period of intense pain and emerge as a poorer but functional mid-sized nation. The EU faces the very real possibility of fragmentation, of ceasing to exist in its current form. The race to the bottom isn't about who loses 1% of GDP next year. It's about whose political system survives the economic reality check that is coming. In the UK, the Union is at risk. In the EU, the Union is the risk. We are entering an era of great correction. The debts will be paid, either through default or through inflation. The standard of living will adjust to the new reality of energy scarcity. The only question left for you is this. Are you prepared? Do you have the assets, the skills, and the mindset to survive in a world where the old powers are crumbling? The history books are being written right now. And for the first time in centuries, Europe and Britain are not the authors. They are the subjects. And it is not a happy ending. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the race for survival. If this analysis gave you a new perspective on the global economy, then our mission is accomplished. There are more battles to analyze, more truths to uncover, and we will be right here to break them down for you. So stay curious, stay skeptical, and I will see you in the next video.